Today, struggling artists can't even dream about affording a studio space in Soho, but 50 years ago, the neighborhood was a haven for artists trying to make it. A new book looks at those early days. Jessica Cordermanch has the story.
In what used to be an industrial wasteland, Soho is now the hip and fashionable neighborhood, a cluster of high-end boutiques and trendy restaurants that cater to expensive tastes. In Illegal Living, 80 Wooster Street and the Evolution of SoHo, Roslyn, Bernstein and Shael Shapiro trace the history of the neighborhood through one single loft building. In the middle of the 20th century, residential use was not allowed in Soho. Zoning laws only permitted industrial use of the buildings.
That's why it was illegal to live there. The zoning didn't allow it. But historically, this was a residential neighborhood. And then most of the residential buildings were torn down, and these industrial buildings were built. And I think people don't understand that. They think, oh, these were always factories, but they weren't. And there still are on Spring Street and other places. A few of those old residential buildings still exist.
George McCunis was the founder of the Flexus art movement. In the 60s, he scoured the neighborhood to find empty lofts that he could buy for very cheap. He then set up a community of artists whom all lived and worked from there.
George wasn't involved with these issues. George just wanted to create, he was a visionary. He didn't care if it was illegal.
By the late 60s, artists from all over the country had invaded these empty manufacturing buildings.
They were always doing these happenings and events, and they were always in the ground floor of 80 Wooster, which happened to be Jonas Mekas' Cinematheque and later his anthology archives. And Jonas was only too happy to have Fluxus events. So one event consisted of some Fluxus artists, including Bob West, dressed in doctor's coats, measuring the tongues of passers-by.
The fact that Soho was a non-residential area did not stop the movement.
Artists were only too happy to come and work here. And even if it didn't work and you didn't become legal, think about it. All you had invested, you had borrowed $5,000 from your aunt or your uncle or your grandfather. Even in those days, that was a lot of money, but it wasn't the end of the world. If you were young, you thought, well, someday I'll make up $5,000. So people were willing to take that risk, right? To come in.
Yeah, I mean...
That's what you did.
Yeah, I said if I lost it, we'll have lived there for a number of years and amortized that expense.
Shapiro, who is an architect, moved into the main building, 80 Wooster Street, in 1967.
Certainly the book is not about me, but some of it does reflect my experience.
He lived there for about 6 years and worked alongside famous faces like John Lennon, Yoko Ono, and avant-garde filmmaker Jonas Mekas.
It was like having an in-house editor when I was writing, because he'd say, no, you got that wrong. No, I was there, and it was like this. So, I mean, we collaborated on the book, and shocking things, stayed married and networked our computers, and each one of us had the ability to override the other. But here we are, so.
Back in 1968, the artists were fighting to legalize their living space.
The idea was that you were allowed to have an artist studio here that's fits in a manufacturing use category. So, and the buildings were vacant, the landlords couldn't rent them, so artists sort of moved in and started to work there as studios, but then they were living there.
Under pressure, the city decided to amend the zoning resolution in 1971. It allowed people that the city would certify as artists to reside and work in the lofts. But by the early 80s, prices started going up, and a lot of the residents who could not afford them were forced to move out. The gentrification of Soho made it a popular spot for tourists. It also evolved into a commercialized fashion district.
Although the art still does exist here and there and everywhere, largely not on the ground level, so that to people who tour the neighborhood with their maps in hand, in Spanish and French and whatever languages, they're looking at, at the cast iron facades, but they barely look up. And so the art on the ground floor, it's fashions, it's eyeglasses, it's makeup, it's home furnishings. But there are some remnants, and many of the artists who came here still live here.
For 219 West, I'm Jessica Cordermanch.